is that Israel has the right to use force to defend itself against Qassam rockets. And that's partially accurate. The rocketing is a criminal act, and it's true that a state has the right to defend itself against criminal attacks, but the claim that a state has the right to use force to do so goes far beyond any principle that we would or should accept. So, for example, I doubt that there are many people here who think that Nazi Germany had a right to defend itself against the terrorism of the partisans, which was quite real. Kristallnacht in 1938 was not justified by the fact that Herschel Greenspan assassinated a German embassy official in Paris. The British were not justified in terrorizing Irish Catholics in response to IRA terror. And incidentally, when they finally sensibly turned to the sensible policy of addressing legitimate grievances in the territory they occupied, the terror ended. It's not a matter of proportionality, that widely used word. It's a matter of choice of action in the first place, proportional or not. Is there a more justified response than violence? Forgetting proportionality. Well, any resort to force always carries a heavy burden of proof. And in every case, including the present case, we have to ask whether it can be met. Can it be met in the case of Israel's effort to quell any resistance to its criminal actions, both in Gaza and in the West Bank, where the criminal actions continue relentlessly? Perhaps I may quote myself, if you don't mind, in an interview in the Israeli press a couple of years ago on Olmert's announced convergence plans for the West Bank. What I said is that the U.S. and Israel do not tolerate any resistance to these plans, preferring to pretend, falsely of course, that there is no partner as they proceed with programs that go back a long way. We may recall that Gaza and the West Bank are recognized to be a unit, so if resistance to the U.S.-Israeli annexation, cantonization programs is legitimate in the West Bank, then it is in Gaza too. I think that's correct. A separate question is whether the modality of resistance is legitimate, a totally separate question. We may agree that Herschel Greenspan committed a criminal act and that the partisans committed terror, but that has nothing to do with the question whether Germany had a right to respond with force, same in the British case. So those are just two questions that should be separated. Dr. Mustafa Barghouti is a highly respected Palestinian parliamentarian and official. He reported that since George Bush's Annapolis extravaganza in November 2007, you may recall much impressive rhetoric about dedication to peace and justice. He reports that since November 2007, Israeli attacks on Palestinians escalated sharply, with an almost 50% increase in the West Bank, along with a sharp increase in settlements and Israeli checkpoints. Now, quite obviously, these criminal actions are not a response to rockets from Gaza, although the converse may well be the case, as he in fact suggests. Israel has a straightforward means to defend itself. Easy. Put an end to the criminal actions in the occupied territories. That means accept the long-standing international consensus on a two-state settlement on the international border with perhaps minor mutual modifications. That's has been an overwhelming international consensus for over 30 years, blocked by the United States and by Israel. That began officially in 1976, Washington's first veto of a Security Council resolution calling for a two-state settlement. I'm not going to run through the rest of the record. There's no time, but it's very clear. Today, U.S.-Israeli rejectionism is even more blatant than it has been in the past, in part because of the Arab League's formal proposal for a settlement that goes beyond the international consensus, calling for normalization of full normalization of relations with Israel. Every time you see the word Hamas in the newspapers, it's accompanied by Iranian-supplied Hamas, not U.S.-supplied Israel, and Hamas, which is committed to the destruction of Israel. What you don't read is Hamas, which long ago joined the international consensus on a two-state settlement that the U.S. and Israel bar. That would be excluded in the free press, biased. But it's a fact. So the Arab League's calling for normalization. Hamas is calling for a two-state settlement. Iran and Hezbollah have made it clear explicitly that they will abide by any agreement the Palestinians accept. That leaves the United States and Israel in splendid isolation, both in word and also, of course, in actions. They're acting to undermine it and make it impossible, day by day. Now, there is one exception, crucial exception, to the persistent rejectionism of the United States and Israel. You'll recall that in the year 2000, there were negotiations in Camp David which collapsed. Contrary to the standard story, President Clinton recognized that the U.S.-Israeli proposals at Camp David were quite unacceptable. And in December 2000, he presented what he called his parameters. They were kind of vague, but they were more forthcoming. You could at least imagine a settlement in those terms. Clinton also gave a speech in which he pointed out that both sides had accepted the parameters and that both sides had reservations. They then met in Taba, Egypt, in January 2001 to resolve the differences, and they came very close to a settlement. In fact, in their final press conference, they said if they'd had a few more days, they could have reached a settlement. The negotiations were canceled at that point by Prime Minister Barak of Israel. That's the one break in 30 years of U.S.-Israeli rejectionism. And I should say that it's not that many years ago. There's no reason why that one break can't be resumed if an American president decides to allow it to be resumed, in which case there will be no shrieks from the famed Israeli lobby, just as there were none at that time, and it could easily be implemented. Well, it's up to us to determine. Well, I've just reported the facts. You can easily affirm that. I'd urge that you verify them. It's not that hard. Give you the sources if you like. But there's a preferred version, which as usual is quite different from the facts. The preferred version, quote Ethan Bronner, the New York Times correspondent in Israel, the preferred version is that many abroad recall Mr. Barak as the prime minister who in 2000 went further than any other Israeli leader in peace offers to the Palestinian, only to see the deal fail and explode in a violent Palestinian uprising that drove him from power. Well, he's partly right. It's true that many abroad believe these fairy tales, thanks to what Bronner and all too many of his colleagues called journalism. There's also a narrower question than the one I've just been discussing. The narrower question puts aside resistance to Israel's ongoing West Bank crimes. And again, when I say Israel, I mean U.S.-Israel crimes, because it can't be done without U.S. authorization and material and diplomatic and, in fact, ideological support. So put aside all that and just consider Gaza alone. Does Israel have peaceful alternatives to the use of force in response to attacks on its territory, just keeping to Gaza alone? Well, the answer is it surely does. It could accept a ceasefire. Sometimes, in fact, it has accepted a ceasefire while